holding this important hearing today. Thank you, Mr. Kampscher, for taking the time to testify. Management of federal buildings throughout the country is no easy undertaking. And I want to talk just a little bit about some of the goals and objectives that have been set. The Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 established the Office of Federal High Performance Buildings to develop best practices, guidance, and tools for government-wide use to reduce cost, enhance human health and performance, and minimize environmental impacts, as you know. GSA has driven improvements to the efficiency of federal buildings through this office, which has been a large success story. Energy efficiency at federal buildings is vastly improved from where we were a decade ago. I do, however, worry that some aspects of the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 have not spurred the desired outcome that was envisioned when the law was enacted. Section 433 of the Energy Independence and Security Act calls for the elimination of all fossil fuel generated energy from federal buildings by 2030. With the growth that we've seen domestically in natural gas over the last decade, I'm not sure this provision has the desired environmental effect that was intended. Natural gas plants replacing coal-fired plants in the power sector have been the greatest factor in reducing carbon emissions to levels we haven't seen, the lowest levels in the last 20 years. But we now have a statute saying that by 2030, there'll be no natural gas used in federal buildings. This is counterintuitive to addressing carbon emissions, and so I want to ask you a couple questions that go to that issue. Number one, can you tell me what percentage of federal buildings currently rely on fossil fuel generated energy?
In GSA's inventory, it's virtually all of them. And
as I think you know, the 2007 Act sets targets for fossil fuels at 80% of all federal buildings being fossil fuel free by 2020. Is this target a realistic one that you expect to meet?
As we build new buildings, we are taking that target into effect on in the buildings that we bring into the inventory, and we are currently achieving the targets that are set in statute.
Well, that applies to new buildings, but for existing inventory, I think you just told me virtually all of the buildings rely on fossil fuels. So do you think that a policy focused on energy efficiency and reduction of carbon emissions at federal buildings, rather than the elimination of all fossil fuels, but instead having a fuel source neutral effort to reduce our overall carbon footprint, would be a better way to foster the environmental mandate?
In my personal opinion, if the goals are very clear, having greater flexibility in the means of achieving them is usually the better way to achieve those goals.
And just to be clear, we're talking about a goal. All the buildings right now rely to some extent on fossil fuels to power them. And we're talking about a reduction by 2020, about 80%. That target's not achievable.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Would you agree with me that the target of reducing fossil fuels, 80%, is not achievable by 2020?
I would agree with you that it's a very difficult goal.
And would you agree with me that it makes sense to revisit the goals and instead of reducing fossil fuels, instead focusing on carbon emissions and reducing emissions?
I'm sure that we would be very happy to provide an opinion to this committee on proposed legislation that would talk about the practicality of achieving the legislation that was drafted.
I think that would be very helpful. I think one of the things that we should strive to do on our committee is set achievable targets. And from your testimony today, I don't think the goal for 2020 or for 2030 seem like they are in sight. So I thank you for your testimony this morning. I look forward to getting additional information from you, and I see that my time is running out, so with that, I will yield back.
Thank you, and I recognize Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.